What you did is the way that species used to be classified. Module 1 is all about classifying based on what? What were you doing? Measuring physical characteristics, measuring bodies, measuring bones. What kind of evidence would that relate to with evolution? Structural evidence. You were looking at biological structures. You were looking at what we sometimes call morphology, shape, to classify these lizards and see who's related to who. Now maybe we could go back and find fossil lizards and place them into groups and start to look at lines of descent, but this was all based on structures. When we watched the whale movie, those ancient species had names. They gave them names, right? That's biological classification. Those names indicate how closely related they are to another species. So when we look at our lizard groups, and these are just my preliminary groups, I looked at this and I said, okay, short legs, that's a structural feature they have in common. I'm going to assume that those three species are related. These all seem to be more tree-dwelling. I see them all up in bigger trees. Maybe they're related. They probably share some structural features. And then I said, well, these guys all seem to be able to hold on to little twigs and branchy pieces. So, maybe they're related. Twig dwellers. I don't know. I'm just guessing. Until you actually have data, you're just guessing. That's how we used to classify things. And that's how we used to trace evolutionary relationships. Pretty much exclusively. We looked at structures, at physical structures. There's a better way. There's a better way. There's another track of evidence. First one, fossil record. What was number 2? Structural evidence. And we said structural evidence was broken down into 2 pieces. What was the first kind of structural evidence? Homologous, yes. But very often people say homologous when they're learning the word. So homologous structures. And what was the other? Vestigial structures. Vestigial structures. Okay, now this brings us to the third major category of evolution, of evidence for evolution. Anybody have a guess what it is? So we've talked so far about, the fossil record and how we can look at ancient, long extinct species, and we can look at their structures and we can classify them. We've looked at structural evidence in living species. There's one other form of evidence for this. Anybody here watch crime shows? I keep asking this question. Those labs are set up pretty nicely. There is chemical evidence for evolution. And we're going to see several types of chemical evidence. So I'll start off by putting A and B there. And we're talking about this because you're going to start Module 2 of the Lizard Lab, and Module 2 looks at chemical evidence of relatedness. So far you've looked at structural evidence of evolutionary relationships between those lizard species. Lizard species. There we go. Now you'll start to look at chemical evidence of relatedness between those lizard species. There, I did it all in one shot. So, how on the crime shows do they use chemical evidence to show relatedness? Actually, this is more a Jerry Springer thing than a crime show thing. How do they show use DNA? Yeah, who's the daddy? DNA. So the first strand of chemical evidence, the first bit of chemical evidence is really, this goes even beyond how much DNA they share. This just goes to the fact that every living thing on Earth uses DNA. How unlikely. That all known living things use the exact same chemical to transmit their genetic information. And all known living things, whether it is a tree, a bacteria, a blue whale, an earthworm, a ladybug, a glorious and glamorous multicellular primate such as yourself, a fox, an earthworm, did I mention earthworms already? A cockroach, a bluegill, a jellyfish, a what? A toad. My friend here, the spotted salamander. All of them use the same chemicals. And right there, that starts to point to some degree of relatedness. But we can take that relatedness piece even further, because when we step back and look at actual DNA sequences, and this is what they do on, you know, Jerry Springer, Maury Povich, whatever, when they do all the Who's the Daddy stuff. They look at how much of a DNA sequence is shared between two individual humans. Okay? Here's the thing. Humans and chimps share 99% of their DNA sequence. So, first of all, let's say this. You and any other human. So, these humans, and this human, very, very different structurally. You know how much of their DNA they share? All humans, you and the most unrelated human on this planet. It's on the order of 99.999%. I may have one more 9 in there than necessary. I'm not sure. I'd have to look that up. But that tiny little difference is enough to make two very different looking humans. You and the most unrelated human on the planet to you share almost all your DNA. So on those, like, Who's the Daddy shows, when they're looking at how much DNA you share, they're looking at that little tiny fraction that's different between humans and seeing how much of it is shared between two humans to determine paternity or maternity, though usually we know who the mother is. That's a tiny fraction of DNA. Well, if we step outside of our own species, within, well, humans and chimps are the most closely related to the two primate groups. We share 99% of our DNA with chimps, most of our DNA. There are not a whole lot of genes that differentiate us from chimps. Other primate species, the relationship is a little bit less strong, but chimps and us are the most closely related. We share the most DNA of any two primate species. This is biological classification. That's what this is. We're looking at how much DNA is shared and looking at how closely related two species are. You and a mouse are both mammals. Okay, so you both have fur, both capable of giving live birth, both capable for females of producing milk for their young. 90% DNA match. So 10% is enough to differentiate you from most other mammals. And if we get down to, now, you know, when we think about animals, like if we think about, we said tetrapods. My little friend here is a tetrapod. You're a tetrapod. Alligators are tetrapods. I didn't do a level of tetrapods. That would have been a good one. We're pretty unsimilar to insects, don't you think? No. They got wings. They got 6 legs. They got those weird compound eyes, many of them, not all of them. Pretty unsimilar. We share 60% of our DNA with fruit flies. 60% of the genes in a fruit fly are the same as the genes that you have. So a 40% different, and I think it's, when you get down to plants, it's like 25 to 30% with most plant species for humans. So the farther away you get in terms of relatedness, the less DNA is shared. What you're going to start to do now is you're going to go back into the lizard lab, and you're going to start Module 2. And Module 2 is all about shared DNA. Shared DNA. So it's going to construct a cladogram, actually a phylogenetic tree for you, based on percentages of shared DNA between those lizard species. Okay? Ja oder nicht? Ja? Good. Okay, get working. I'll put the submission box on there.